Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Dunn. In this screencast, we're talking about measures of dispersion. That is the range and standard deviation. What we're going to be doing in this screencast is we're going to find the standard deviation and the range by hand of a group of data, and we're going to do that to measure dispersion. And then we're going to do this with technology. So we'll use the TI-83 or the TI-84 to find standard deviation. All right, so we're talking about measures of dispersion today. Measures of dispersion are, and the ones we're going to be calculating are range and standard deviation. And they are used to measure the variability of the data. So this might include the spread of the data, how spread out it is, which is the range, and how far the data is from the mean, which is standard deviation. So first we have the range. Quite simply, the range is the difference between the highest value and the lowest value. So for example, if once again we're talking about test scores on a midterm, to find the range, you just have to find the biggest value and the smallest value and subtract them. So the biggest value is 100, the smallest value is 64, and so the difference is 36. That's the range. That's pretty easy. All right, standard deviation is not that easy. In standard deviation, first of all, there are two symbols to represent that. The lowercase letter s or the Greek letter sigma. S is the sample standard deviation and sigma is the population standard deviation. In this course, we're exclusively going to be talking about sample standard deviation. Okay. The process is listed here. First, we have to find the mean. Then we're going to make a chart which shows the data values, the difference between the data and the mean, and the square of that difference. Then what we're going to do is fill out those columns. Then we're going to find the sum of the third column, divide that by 1 less than the number of data, and find the square root of that answer. I know that sounds really confusing. Let's go through it. It's best to look at an example. Okay, I'm just going to use 6 values here because we're going to find the standard deviation by hand, and it's quite cumbersome and it takes a little bit of time. So there are 6 values here. First thing we need to do is find the mean of those 6 values. So the mean is 81.7, approximately 81.7. The next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to make a chart. We're going to list the data. Then we're going to, which I've already did, I listed the data. I put it in order, but you don't need to. Then we're going to find the difference between the data and the mean, and then we're going to square that difference. I did the first line for you. So we're going to take the data value 64, and we're going to subtract the mean from it. So 64 minus 81.7. And the difference is negative 17.7. And we're going to square that. Be careful that you're using these parentheses correctly. So negative 17.7. Notice that I'm putting it in parentheses before I square it. That's important because if you just put a negative sign in front of there and you don't use parentheses, whoops, I forgot to square that. Sorry. Let me do that again. So if I don't put parentheses around there, I'm going to get a negative value. And none of these values should be negative. They should all be positive. Now, this might have some negative values, but this will all be positive. So remember to use parentheses when you're squaring it. Now, these can be negative because, see, remember I said the standard deviation is measuring how far you are from the mean? Well, 64 is below the mean. That's why this value is negative. Any value that's below the mean is going to have a negative value here. Any value that's above the mean is going to be positive. You can pause the screencast and fill out the rest of the chart and check to see that you have it correctly. But I went ahead and filled that out for you on the next screen. So here's the table all filled out. What we have to do is we have to add the data minus the mean scores square, and we're going to add those together, the square of all of those. So that's this column. Okay, I'm sort of saying this in a weird way, but what the top half of this, the numerator of this fraction that's under the square root, is the sum of these values. So we're going to find that total, which I did on the next screen. I just added these numbers together. So that's 1299.25. Now I'm going to put that information in this formula. So 1299.25, the sum of these values, divided by 5. Now why divided by 5? Well, there are 6 values here. So 6 minus 1 is 5. First, I'm going to divide those. So I would do 1299.85 divided by 5, which is 259.97. And then we want to find the square root of that. So we're going to press second square root, and I'll put 259. Don't do any rounding. Put that whole number in there, 0.97, and press enter. And we find that the standard deviation is approximately 16.1. Okay, now let's look at how we would do that on the calculator. Oh, I forgot one thing I wanted to show you. Luckily, I wrote it down here. When we found the sum, and before we took the square root, that s squared is called the variance. That might come up when you're doing your homework, and you might see that when you're in stats, so I wanted to point that out. So before you find the square root, that value is sometimes talked about in statistics as the variance. Okay, now we're going to do that on the calculator. It's so much easier to do on the calculator. All right, so let me clear this screen so it's clear to you. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to, let me go back for a second. All right. The first thing we're going to do is enter the data. Then we're going to calculate the 1-var statistics again and identify the sample standard deviation. So let's put the data in our calculator. We did this in the previous screencast. Press Stat and Edit. So remember, I did this in the previous screencast, so I'm going to clear that data, highlight L1, press Clear, and Enter, and all that data disappears, and I'll enter my new data, which is 64, 65, 75, 99, 100, and 87. Okay, make sure you press enter when you're done. Press second and quit, and we're going to press that stat key again. Use the right arrow to toggle over to calculate. We're going to do 1-var statistics again. From list 1, press enter. And the standard deviation is right here, 16.12. We rounded it to 1 decimal point, that's 16.1. So much easier to do on the calculator. Good luck!